Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first of our three-part series, Grappling with Gauguin. Over the next few weeks, we'll be featuring presentations by art historians, artists, and curators from around the world who will be addressing the legacy of Paul Gauguin and how it resonates with international audiences today. This webinar series is presented in parallel with our continued work on the Gauguin catalog raisonné, which you can find on our website, wpi.art. While the catalog raisonné presents the artist's work with data points about provenance and historical exhibitions, many of the critical discussions surrounding Gauguin in recent years have focused on his problematic persona and contemporary objections to his behavior and viewpoint. But how do these new perspectives impact the reception of his art? Our goal with this series is to explore how Gauguin continues to factor into our cultural discourse, and specifically how curators today are contending with the presentation of Gauguin's art. So for today's talk, we are pleased to have Laura Cosendey and Fernando Oliva from the Sao Paulo Museum of Art, better known as MASP, in Brazil. Fernando Oliva is a researcher, professor, and curator with a PhD in art criticism and art history from the University of Sao Paulo. He is part of the curatorial team at MASP, which organized the recent exhibition this past summer, Paul Gauguin, The Other and I. He is also a curator for the third Bahia Biennial, the curatorial director of the Sao Paulo Cultural Center, and curator at Museu das Artes and the Museum of Image and Sound in Sao Paulo. Laura Cosendey is an assistant curator at MASP, and for the past year has been working alongside Fernando and Adriano Pedrosa on the exhibition Paul Gauguin, The Other and I. Laura has a master's degree in history, criticism, and theory of art at the State University of Rio de Janeiro. She was also a curator at the 33rd Sao Paulo Biennial, and currently she is working on a Francis Bacon exhibition to be held at MASP in 2024 as part of a year-long curatorial program dedicated to queer histories. After Laura and Fernando give their presentations, we will have some time for a Q&A with the audience, and I'll ask you to put all of your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. And now I will turn it over to our speakers, Laura and Fernando. Thank you very much. It's all yours, Laura.
Good afternoon. So first of all, we would like to thank Elizabeth and the team for the invitation. I will share my screen. Just a moment. Can you see it? Well, for this presentation today, Fernando, Oliva, and I would like to address some points related to the paintings by Gauguin that belong to the Museu de Arte de São Paulo in Brazil, the collection, where we both work as curators. This research began in the development of an exhibition project entitled Paul Gauguin, The Other and I, which was held at MASP early this year from April to August. And the project also involved an online seminar, which you can find on MASP's YouTube channel. And we also published a catalog with 9 new essays, the first book in Portuguese to address the contemporary issues on Gauguin's work. The MASP holds 2 paintings by Paul Gauguin, the Fisherman and Self-Portrait near Golgotha. Both are from the Tahitian period. In fact, both were produced in 1896. And for this talk, we will analyze the trajectory of the latter, Self-Portrait near Golgotha, as a historical object, as a witness of different context, an object of different readings, painting of special significance to the artist, from the moment of its production to the context in which it was donated to MASP. This Self-Portrait near Golgotha is a special painting in Gauguin's life and work. After spending a 2-year period in Tahiti in the early 1890s and a short interlude in Paris, Gauguin would return to the South Pacific island in 1896. The same year he painted this self-portrait. Okay, so I forgot to. This is the exhibition view, but we can come. And the 2 paintings from MASP collection. And in Tahiti, Gauguin produced his most emblematic works, setting himself apart from the typical Parisian artists. He would claim the identity of a wild artist, especially due to his Peruvian origins on his mother's side. And Gauguin has actually lived in Lima in his childhood. He performed through different means what he would call his savage blood, and his Inca profile was always highlighted in his self-portrait, accentuating the straight lines of his nose. And one could say that this search for his Latin American origins would motivate his journey to the Caribbean island of Martinique, but that's another chapter in this story. And in a way, this also motivated his decision to live in Polynesia. Gauguin attempted to detach himself from his European identity. His trips to Tahiti became paradigmatic. He became the artist who cut links with his life in family and living in the French art community in order to dive into the imagery of the distant Pacific Islands, which was seen by his contemporary as an idealized, untouched, and exuberant world. His attitudes and worldviews opened pathways to modernist, avant-garde, and narratives centered around the figure of a pioneer. And he would become a heroic figure to those that idealized and built the mythology of primitivism. And in his artworks, notebooks, journals, and letters, Gauguin performed his own image as an artist, and the self-portrait near Golgotha is a poignant example of it. So let's take a look at the picture. Gauguin is in the center of the picture with this striking gaze. He stares at us like deeply. He's portrayed with the long hair combed back and has his iconic mustache. He wears a simple and loose-fitting light blue tunic, and his skinny face reveals the artist's depressive state by the time. On his right, we see the head of a Tahitian figure floating on the top corner of the canvas, and inscribed in the lower left corner, one can read near Golgotha, près de Golgotha. The word Golgotha designates the place where Jesus was crucified, also known as the Calvary, the place of the skull. On the backside, one can notice the entrance of a cave. And in this context, Gauguin's thin tunic could also be seen as a shroud while he walks to his own entombment. And Gauguin's figure is outlined with a subtle contour in light green as a sort of halo or aura, enhancing the painting's mythical feel, while the artist is lit by light color tones, and in his shadow, a figure in profile blends with the rocky texture of a mountain. Here, I don't know if you can see my and almost mingling with the artist. And Gauguin had already portrayed himself similarly to Jesus Christ during his period in Brittany. In fact, the painting could also be seen as in dialogue with Dürer's self-portrait, an ambitious gesture against all convention of its time. Dure's work emphasized the individuality of the artist, who represents himself with long curly hair, but with a more sumptuous dressing. But Gauguin, however, adopted an image that is markedly different from Dure's. He's wearing a simple garment. He experiences the most dramatic moment in the Christian narrative, and yet inserts the scene in a context that could be seen as a savage to the eyes of many conservative and religious groups. From the image of the artist as Christ emerges the idea of a misunderstood character, a man who couldn't be effectively understood by his peers in the art scene, and he had already associated himself with the figure of Jesus in previous works as the Christ in the Garden of Olives. Which is missing here? Sorry. Here, though, he's placed in the most dramatic moment of the Christian narrative, the climax of passion. He's a misunderstood character, not only a victim, he's also a martyr. Subtly hidden behind Gauguin, a secondary figure appears to almost merge with him. Is it detaching from Gauguin's body, or is it a different self? Is it his Tahitian double or his own other? Gauguin's thin face and the reference to the Calvary reflects the difficult moment the artist was living through at the time. He was ill with syphilis, and the disease caused him significant pain. By the same period, Gauguin wrote in a letter to his friend, Daniel de Montfort, "I'm so demoralized, so discouraged that I don't believe in greater misfortunes to come." In the following year, he received news of the death of his daughter, Aline, with whom he had a strong bond, and shortly after completing one of his most ambitious paintings, Where Do We Come From?, he took arsenic in a failed suicide attempt. It is thus not surprising that he's dressed himself as Christ in the ethics of passion. So the self-portrait near Golgotha is a testimony of his depression. And this self-representation also embeds a series of ambiguities, like certain traits of androgyny. In fact, when he first arrived in Tahiti in 1891, due to his long hair and quirky way of dressing, he was associated with a mahu, a Tahitian non-binary identity, also called as the third gender. And this silhouette behind him is similar with that of Ovidi, the first statue created by Gauguin, which in a way, so Gauguin synthesizes in this painting the Christian religious spirit and the supposed symbols of local and indigenous peoples. In Gauguin's work mixed mythology. So, and this relationship between Christian religiosity and elements of other cultures is recurrent in Gauguin's work. And in the same year of 1896, in savage barbarian poems, a Tahitian angel with strong Buddhist iconographic influences becomes the main character. The hand gestures, originally found in Java reliefs, recurrently repeated by the artist, can also be seen in a similar unconventional gesture. A scene of birth of Jesus. The birth of Jesus was depicted in simplicity, set in a Tahitian home, as we can see in The Son of God from the same year. So the self-portrait near Golgotha witness Gauguin's final exile in Tahiti, and the fact that Gauguin kept this painting close to him from 1996 suggests his great attachment to it. It was found among Gauguin's belongings after the artist died, one of the few paintings left after his final shipment of works to France. The first person to buy the work was the French collector and doctor and poet Victor Ségalin. As an admirer of Gauguin, he took advantage of a business trip to try to meet the artist personally in the Marquesas Island. But when he finally managed to get there, Gauguin was dead. He passed away a few weeks before his arrival. And Ségalin was one of the first people to enter, to get in the artist's studio and produce an inventory of all the objects found there, including the remaining works. And he noticed the painting on the wall and described it as a painful portrait. So later he bought the painting for only 15 francs in an auction in Tahiti, in Papeete, to cover the artist's outstanding debts. It was cheaper than a sewing machine that was also being sold in the same auction. And Ségalin wrote about his experience in the book Gauguin dans son dernier décor. And returning to Paris, Ségalin sold the painting to the influential art dealer Ambroise Volat, who kept the painting until 1936, when it passed to the hands of the French André Weil. And finally, in 1951, the Knodder Gallery in New York purchased the painting directly from Weil and transferred it to Pietro Maria Bardi and MASP in 1952. And at the time, the museum paid $48,000, the equivalent today to $510,000. So what happens when the painting when the painting is taken from this intimate space and this intimate experience of the artist passes through the hands of galleries and is finally placed in a museum in Brazil? So how was it perceived in the final place of rest? Fernando, I think I can't hear you.
Okay, so let's go. So it's important to remember that Pietro Maria Bardi and Lina Bobardi, the couple who created MASP, they arrived in Brazil in a post-war context at the middle of the 1940s. In the Brazilian cultural context at the time, Lina Bobardi borrowed the concept of authority from the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci. There is important to understand this difference between the idea of popular in an American sense that is very different from the way we use it here. Is pretty more linked to folk. So when I say popular, you could read as folk, okay? But it's important to remember that for this couple, and especially for Lina, it came from the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci. So the Gramsci desire for authority, which sought popular participation and representation, was assimilated by Lina and became fundamental for the major exhibitions in MASP, such as the pioneering, now famous, exhibition The Hand of the Brazilian People, A Mão do Povo Brasileiro, in 1968, already in the new building, which established a dialogue between artistic practice, placing works by authors who were considered others, like folk artists, indigenous artists, which were often classified as primitive, alongside consecrated works within the art canon. Some people think there is a new trend in MASP here in Brazil, but we are always trying to remember that it was on the conceptual basis of the creation of the museum. It was not something that curators here invented 10 years ago. We are always have to stress that. Therefore, the idea of perceiving your own people as the other is crucial to understanding the contributions of Bobardi and her search to experiment with forms of knowledge that were seen as subaltern, especially here in Brazil, and especially in the 40s and the 50s. MASP's architects sought to understand Brazilian culture within a regional and popular context, folk context, whilst lending it a universal cosmopolitan character. So, Self-Portrait near Golgotha, the painting from Gauguin, was acquired by MASP in 1951 from the traditional American gallery Nodder and Company, and was then officially presented in Brazil in October of the next year, 1952, at an event in Rio de Janeiro. It was the capital at the time. Gauguin's Self-Portrait arrived in Brazil at a very particular moment in the Brazilian art system, relationship to the history of the perception of the other. The turn of the 1950s is considered a watershed moment for the notion of the primitive or folk art, particularly after exhibition Folk Ceramics from Pernambuco in 1947, which was conceived by educator Augusto Rodrigues. He was very close to the Bardis, to Lina and Pietro at the time. In a wider context, the 40s and the 50s were marked by an official interest in modern art in Brazil, with the creation of the first modern art museums in the country, the São Paulo Museum of Modern Art and the Rio de Janeiro Museum of Modern Art in 1958, as well the first edition of the São Paulo Biennial in 1951. And evidently, there was also MASP, founded in 1947, in a moment there was simultaneously within and beyond the idea of the modern, precisely due to the conceptual interests of its founders, Lina and Pietro Maria Bardi, in the issue of the primitive, the popular, the regional, the naive, the indigenous, and all their derivations. In other words, it was again the Bardis couple's unique appetite for everything that fell outside the official canon and tradition. In other words, the other. As we know, many European artists that became known as modern were in fact against the process of modernization, industrialization, and urbanization, which is precisely the case for Gauguin and other artists, including those coming from the Pont Neuf school, who were in search of a lost essence, between quotes, of course, a lost essence of life and art, in places that were considered isolated, primitive, be it in Brittany, the French Polynesia, or South America. That is, there was a primitive tendency, which was also parasitic to a certain extent. There was being built inside the modern, whilst simultaneously being opposed to it. It is important to remember that this notion of primitivism is part of the context from which modern art emerged at the end of the 19th century in Europe, especially in Paris. Modes of representation that opposed urban Western culture always coexisted with the notion of modernity that were more concerned with the aesthetic potential of urban themes. For the Bardis, accounting for this sort of parasitic presence and its encounter with the art historical canon was the basis of their projects, both for a museum in the tropics in Brazil and the constitution of the MASP collection. Their collection of works had to present, without hierarchy, works by modernist masters such as Gauguin alongside primitive artworks, which played the role of the other from the point of view of the European art canon. This choice is noticeable from the start, with the so-called exposições didáticas, educational exhibitions, a notable aspect of the museum's early years in the 40s, which consisted of the display of myriad informative documents and materials in modular panels designed by Lina, like the one titled On Prehistory and Primitive Peoples, addressing ancient Mediterranean cultures. Of course, MASP and other museums doesn't use the word primitive anymore. So I'm referring here to the original name of these shows, of course. The strategy of creating friction between modern tradition and the primitive would remain prevalent at MASP throughout the 50s, the time of the so-called Great Exhibitions, when Barbie secured in Europe and the United States the artworks that would become the pillars of the museum collection, including our Gauguin's works, Self-Portrait near Golgotha and Poor Fisherman. It is also at this point that the museum acquired several works by Brazilian primitive artists, such as Mestre Vitalino, Agostinho Batista de Freitas, and José Antônio da Silva. A brief list of the main exhibitions that took place at MASP in the 50s give us a panoramic view of the context in which Gauguin's work arrived at the museum and in Brazil. Indigenous art exhibition of folkloric drawings by Diógenes Duarte Pais. It was a folk artist from the countryside of São Paulo. A solo show by Agostinho Batista de Freitas. It was a self-taught artist who Bardi saw displaying his works on the street nearby the museum at the time at downtown São Paulo. Exhibition of miniatures and paintings from India. And in 1953, the year after the arrival of Gauguin's Self-Portrait, an exhibition of black art. We must also highlight the pioneering exhibition Art from the Alienated, featuring works made by psychiatric patients at the Hospital Engenho de Dentro in Rio de Janeiro. All these exhibitions, from those on the primitive to those that included the work of psychiatric patients, black art, indigenous art, were always understood as outside the canon, not on the modern canon specifically, but also outside traditional art history itself. In this context, the self-portraits of Gauguin's self-portraits arrival in Brazil and its reception by the Brazilian media and art critics is part of a situation that curiously reiterated in allegorical terms the myth of the primitive, which has been so dear to MASP and the Bardis, and that Gauguin nourished throughout his life and in his work. It is worth adding here a crucial fact that is often left out of Gauguin's biographies and the analysis of his work is that he was also a self-taught artist. Unlike the majority of his colleagues, he never formally studied art. Before being brought to the museum on the evening of October 27, 1952, the painting was exhibited in Rio de Janeiro in the home of the Soares Sampaio family, who lived in a house typical of the Brazilian elite. This was a strategic decision made by Assis Chateaubriand, the media tycoon who created MASP. It was Chateaubriand who gave Bardis the money to go to Europe and acquire all the European modern works and also works from the Renaissance. So there was a strategic decision made by Assis Chateaubriand and Pietro Maria Bardi, as well as a very common practice at the time. The idea was that this kind of event would raise new donations for the museum collection amongst the wealthy families that were systematically requested to donate funds, like the Sampaio Moreiras. Of course, the reception received ample coverage by Chateaubriand's communication network, the Associated Diaries, the most important, the larger media group, the Brazil at the time. It includes several newspapers, magazines, radio stations, and even a pioneering television station. As you can see in a picture from the time, published in Diário da Noite, a staging structure similar to an easel was built to display the painting to the guests. The background, which shows exuberant palm trees, a type of vegetation that is both typically Brazilian and strongly associated with generic idea of the tropics, and an exoticized landscape, is symbolically relevant. One of the main articles about the acquisition published at the time, written by Chateaubriand himself, was given the sensationalist title of In the Tropical Jungle. In his typical writing style, full of adjectives and superlatives, Chateau, as he was known, highlights how the house garden, featuring many mango and jackfruit trees, was the perfect scene for the exotic land narrative that accompanied the painting. So I will cite directly Chateaubriand's texts. Could there be a landscape more suggestive of a Polynesian island than this milky, profound night, walking around the welcoming shades of trees and feeling the subtle sensations of the Sampaio Moreira's family garden? Isn't the launch of a Gauguin in the middle of tropical plants a way of bringing back to the painting brought from Tahiti the particular atmosphere that the vast nomad Gauguin went to look for by instinct in Oceania? Chateaubriand closed the article by drawing a parallel between Gauguin's hypothetical landscape and the garden in the home of the patron hosting the reception. To welcome the self-portrait, Miss Álvaro Sampaio created the landscape from the painter of the Pacific jungle would have loved. Around the house, in its luxuriant garden, with palm trees, mango, and jackfruit trees, we find a scenario that could quench the tropical hunger of that sad faun, Gauguin. Amidst the tropical exuberance, the self-portrait enters Rio de Janeiro the way it left Tahiti, having the jungle as the scenery for its magical appearance. Amongst Brazilian art critics, the interest in Gauguin had certainly been there before the arrival of the painting in Brazil, mainly on the part of the most influential art critic of the time in the country, Mario Pedrosa, whose intellectual practice repeatedly turned to the issue of the other and the canon, in which the category of primitive gained renewed interest in Brazil. In an article from 1949 in Correio da Manhã, one of the main newspapers in Brazil of the time, Pedrosa published Gauguin and the Island's Appeal, an analysis based on a retrospect show that was taking place in Paris at the Museu de l'Orangerie to celebrate a year late the centenary of the artist's birth. The critic writes, what was Gauguin looking for in Oceania? The exotic? No, the universal. That which is irreducible in nature and the primitive. In Tahiti, he paints only local themes that are as valid as they are picturesque. He attempts to capture the intimate side of the man of all times, more visible in the confines of virgin regions, such as the Oceania Islands, than in Paris. And this is an evasion, no doubt, but before space and time, he is in search of archetypal forms of life. The tropical man of the jungle lives outside time. Symptomatically, Pedrosa all talks about a tropical jungle. His text carries within it the contradictions of the time and of a critic who wrote from a place that was then considered peripheric, Brazil and Brazilian art. However, he is reinforcing the idea of the primitive that could be found somewhere else, in other lands, in another time, but without forfeiting its universal meaning, a notion that was very dear to a humanist and Marxists such as Pedrosa. It is not by chance that this was the desire behind not only Brazilian modernism in general, but also Lina Bo and Pietro Maria Sbardi's enterprise in creating MASP and selecting the artworks that would constitute the collection, in which Gauguin's self-portrait is still a major emblem today. To invert symbols, to undo the image of a Brazilian representation that was able to go beyond the merely exotic. For Lina, most of all, it meant moving away from the biggest possible sin in this case, to flirt with the folkloric under a paternalistic view of self-taught, popular, primitive artists. In this sense, the status of both Gauguin's self-portrait and the modern artist, laden with criticism and controversy, goes beyond its mere presence in the collection displayed on the museum's second floor, the famous glass easels display, where it has placidly spent the last 7 decades. To find here, at the beginning of the 21st century, an art and a museum context in the full process of deconstruction, where many others are contemplating the museum from within, and where Gauguin and his ways of seeing himself and others can be reinserted in new and unexpected ways, with the difference that, from now on, he will no longer be the only protagonist. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fernando and Laura. Thank you. I have some questions, and before I start asking my questions, I'll just remind everyone, if you have any questions for Fernando and Laura, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So, Fernando, I was interested in something that you said about the sort of equalizing approach of the Bobardis in exhibiting so-called primitive art with European art, European masterworks, so to speak. And then at the end of your presentation, you show the slide of the Gauguin amongst a lot of other European masterworks. So was the idea to install the work when it was acquired in 1952 among other examples of Brazilian folk art, and that was going to extend throughout the museum? And what changed?
Well, certainly it was shown alongside primitive Brazilian art, folk Brazilian art, but on our main collection, the glass easels, it doesn't happen often. I think it's one of the contradictions in our history, because it was created by Lina as a display that's supposed to be free and supposed to be light, and you can change it all the time. But in fact, the truth is that it's very hard to change, not only because it's heavy, it's a concrete basis with a very fragile glass surface, is one of these jokes, I think, one of her tricks, but also for cultural and institutional issues. The museum only did a great change with this new administration when Adriano Pedrosa and other curators enters about 9 years ago, that we were able to really change the collection. In fact, we are seeing one of these contradictions between a modern idea of museum and a very conservative art milieu. Well, if you think that, if you know that the glass easels, they were taking off for about 20 years. They were off from 1996 to 2016. Laura, would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, sure. I'm looking if I have any other pictures from the gallery space, because maybe it's useful to see how it changed. But yeah, I think what was very radical as well at the time when the museum, the present building in 1968 opened, is that this exhibition Fernando mentioned, the hand of the Brazilian people, was happening at the same time as the major acquisitions that engaged the elite. So of course you have to negotiate with the donors every time. So you put the glaciers on the top floor, and in the other part, and in the floor below, you put this great exhibition of anonymous artists, and in the same level of the canonical art history. So I think this is something to that we have to think also when in this original moment. But as well, more recently, even though I showed this picture of it's not like present day, but I also have here an example of how today we are also proposing some different dialogues. So we have this European part of the collection. In fact, the collection now is back forward. It begins only with Black artists and then indigenous artists and the recent donations. And we also have some dialogues between artworks from different periods. And can you see my picture? Yeah.
Yes.
So this is, we have Vitor Meirelles painting of Moema. Besides the Nilson Baniwa, Moema is a tragic heroine from an epic poem from Brazilian history, literature, in fact. And she also operates in a way as this indigenous Venus, even though in the case she is dead, and this is significant in this picture, and she's beside the Nilson Baniwa, Baniwa artist, which is representing the deforesting and this work, and also the dying, well, and the destruction of not only the forest, not only nature, but indigenous people. So I think these are the kind of dialogue that we are working and trying to explore as much as possible.
So this
here, I think this is also an interesting historic picture, and the easels in the moment where they were installed.
Oh, I see. I have a question for you, either one of you, about the Bobardis and their acquisition of Gauguin. I understood from the talk was very much to present Gauguin as equal and on par with the artists of Brazil to a certain degree. And I also understood, if I'm not mistaken, that was really, it was kind of a populist movement to kind of show the people of Brazil that your art is as exalted as works of European masters. But I'm also wondering, was there another motivation to do this? Were the Bobardis collectors with a market agenda? And were they trying to present Brazilian art on par with international masters for their own kind of market purposes, to elevate not only the cultural value, but the monetary value, perhaps, of some of these lesser known artists in Brazil who perhaps they collected themselves?
I'm not sure if we can talk about a market motivation, but I think it's more like a cultural strategy. If we think that this moment in the 50s, MASP is the first modern museum in Brazil, even though we don't carry the name Museum of Modern Art because we are not focused in modern art. It's modern in the concept of an art institution. And the way the works were presented and this educational exhibitions Fernando also mentioned. So I think it's more in the way that art history should be taught. Not taught is not the experienced in a not so hierarchical and more fluid and more close to the different publics in Brazil. Fernando.
Oh, certainly it was a trend at the time to collect folk art, Brazilian folk art. It goes and came back, you know. It is a kind of trend that goes away and came back. This time, I think we are seeing a coming back of this. But as always in the Brazilian art system, I think it doesn't have a strong basis. This trend, for instance, in the 50s, it was championed by Pietro Maria Bardo, of course. The market was very, very little, very small. I think you can't say at a art market in Brazil in the 50s, but even small, Pietro Maria Bardi played a very special role in it. He was a smart guy, to say the little, and a man of his time. We must say that he has a commercial art gallery, and it was nearby the museum. And he made all these connections, for instance, with Maria Auxiliadora, one of the artists that she was like forgotten for 40 years. And it was a comeback based on a MASP exhibition some years ago. And in Brazil, you also have to know that Latin American in general, that okay, it's a problem. They were not right. They were not doing in a very Christian way, but it was that or nothing at the time. I just want to say that there was market issues, but I think they were not decisive, as you can see today. No.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Okay, a different question on a different topic. Lara, you talked about Gauguin's Latin American origins, so to speak, his time in Peru. I'm wondering when this work was brought into Brazil, was Gauguin looked upon, or was he placed as a Latin American artist? Was he kind of considered that way, and was he promoted that way by MASP upon accessioning the work into their collection?
I think that wasn't. I think this is something interesting when we think on what happens when we exhibit works by Gauguin, and this would also be something if we exhibit works from Martinique. Which presents a closer context, we could say, from the depictions we have here from the 19th century. But I think it was more like he built himself this idea of wild or non-conventional artists, but I'm not sure if they really sold them as a Latin American artist. I think it was more like to bring what he was representing in his own context.
Okay. And then lastly, my last question for you is, how often does he leave your museum? Is he integral to the part of your museum that that everyone comes to the museum to see this work? And if so, when you lend him, how often is he lent?
I'm not sure if I understood what you said.
Oh,
First.
sure.
Please
I'm wondering if the painting is ever lent outside of Brazil. Does it feature in exhibitions outside of Brazil, and how frequently, or is it usually at the museum?
I think this is a very good question, because talking about the exhibition we had this year, we had 40 paintings, 40 works of Gauguin, 20 paintings, and each one of them was a result of a negotiation process with other institutions. So Gauguin, our self-portraits are our Gauguin's works, as well as the rest of our European art collection, is very important for us also as a means to make this exhibition projects possible. I think for curators and art historians I'm not responding directly to your question, sorry.
No, that's fine.
A short detour. But I think one of the Gauguin's challenge for us outside the US and Europe is to really work with Gauguin, like to get these works to the museums and exhibition outside. And to develop a critical view on this, if you are not seeing it actually. So you have Linda Knockling's famous critics from the 70s, but the Metropolitans was like in her backyard. So we don't really have access to these kinds of works, and not even to the text, the critical readings. This is why I think it's important for us to say that we publish this catalog, because there are not much work in Portuguese. In Spanish, not so much, but in Portuguese, we only have like one art, old things, like in the great masters and from collections, and or in, I don't know, one article on primitivism and things like that. So I think it's something we have to develop if we want to have this kind of discussions outside the institution in US and Europe. But yes, both works from Gauguin are very frequently requested for major exhibitions in these institutions in the US.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I have a question here from Victoria Habda, who's asking, I would love to hear about MASP's Indigenous Histories exhibition and its connection to the Gauguin show. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, we have just opened this exhibition last Friday, I think. It's a major show in which Fernando and I weren't involved, so it's important to say that. But it's a huge project, inviting curators from across different territories. And in fact, this is a group show, but it's part of a year-long cycle dedicated to the indigenous histories, as we do every year. So and through the year, we had exhibitions only by indigenous artists from different and solo shows. And yes, Gauguin is the other in this context. Gauguin, but in a way, we had this other experiences in bringing some discussions from our collection, because we are a museum with a very representative Western art collection, and to make this collection, well, alive, we also have to create context to address different issues and not only putting them in a narrative of art history. So I think it's also a means to address this his work through different lens.
Okay, well, thank you. I think that is all the questions that we have, and I think we're just about running out of time. If there's anything else that either one of you would like to address before we close.
I would like just to tell a little a story I heard from one of these indigenous artists at the opening. As Laura said, we are not directly involved, but we were at the opening. We talked to some of them. There were artists from Oceania, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. But even the Brazilian artists, most of them, we personally didn't know them. And one of these artists, Guillermo Lai, we sit front to front in an opening dinner, something like that, an event like that. And he told me that he came from the Oiapoque. Oiapoque is the far north. It's nearby Suriname. And so he told me that he took 5 days to get to São Paulo, and 3 days on a boat, 3 days on a small boat with his work, with his painting, because there were no other way. And after he take a plane trip that were 2 days, so 5 days to get to São Paulo with his work. And I think we must accept that in a way we depend a little bit on the market, because I think it's a problem, not only in Brazil, but we see that most of these indigenous artists, most of them are already on galleries. And of course, is easier to get the works and to do a show. And in Brazil, especially with the dimension of the country, it will be impossible or so expensive to do it without some kind of support. So it's something that was remarkable, I think, the talk of these artists, and that's it.
No, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. If we don't have any more questions, I think we have come to the end, and I'd like to thank both Fernando and Laura for sharing their presentation with us. And I remind those of you who are still tuned in and interested in attending next week's talk on Thursday, November 2nd at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be having Dr. Caroline Vercoe from the University of Auckland to continue with our international invitees. So please tune in next week. And once again, thank you very much for joining us, everyone. And thanks again to you, Laura and Fernando. Have a good afternoon.